There are moments when the universe changes your life through events so obvious that nobody could possibly ignore them. Then there are moments when the greatest transformation begins in complete silence, hidden beneath ordinary conversations, familiar routines, and emotions that seem impossible to explain. July 14th and July 15th belong to the second kind. At first glance, nothing about these 2 days appears extraordinary. The calendar moves forward exactly as it always has. People wake up, check their phones, continue unfinished conversations, worry about tomorrow, and assume life is following the same direction it followed yesterday. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance, the emotional landscape has already begun rearranging itself with remarkable precision. The strange part is that almost nobody will recognize it while it is happening. They will only understand its importance weeks later, when they suddenly realize that everything began changing during 2 days they almost overlooked completely. If you've recently felt unusually emotional without understanding why, if old memories have been returning one after another, if your intuition has become louder than your thoughts, or if you've quietly sensed that your life is approaching a chapter that feels impossible to describe, do not dismiss those feelings. They are not random. Your awareness is responding to a sequence the sky has been preparing for days. Earlier this week, hidden truths slowly began rising to the surface. Relationships quietly revealed what words could no longer hide. Familiar emotional patterns started feeling strangely uncomfortable. Questions that had remained unanswered for weeks finally began pointing toward unexpected understanding. None of those moments existed independently. Every alignment was preparing your inner world for what now begins unfolding between July 14th and July 15th. Astrology has always taught that meaningful transformation rarely happens through one dramatic event. It happens through carefully timed sequences. First, the universe slows you down. Then it reveals what you were moving too quickly to notice. After that, it asks whether you are willing to accept the truth you have finally discovered. Only then does it quietly place a new beginning in front of you. That final stage begins now. July 14th carries the emotional energy of a new moon in Cancer, and throughout history, new moons have symbolized far more than simply another lunar phase. They represent invisible beginnings. Unlike a full moon, which illuminates what has already grown, a new moon begins in darkness. Nothing appears obvious. Nothing seems complete. Yet beneath the surface, an entirely new cycle quietly takes its first breath. Think about planting a seed beneath the earth. The moment it enters the soil, nothing changes on the surface. Looking at the ground, it appears exactly the same as before. Days pass, sometimes weeks. Still, there is no visible evidence that anything extraordinary is happening. Yet beneath the soil, life has already begun organizing itself. Tiny roots reach into darkness long before the first green leaf ever touches the sunlight. Human transformation follows exactly the same rhythm. Before your future becomes visible, it quietly begins developing where nobody else can see it. That is why these next 48 hours should never be measured only by external events. The greatest movement may happen inside your own awareness. You may suddenly realize that something you've been chasing no longer feels important. You may notice that a fear which once controlled every decision suddenly feels much smaller than it did only days ago. You may wake up with a quiet certainty that a chapter has ended, even though nothing dramatic happened to announce its conclusion. Those moments are not insignificant. They are often the first signs that your life has already started moving toward an entirely different future. Cancer has always been associated with emotional security, family, memory, belonging, and the invisible foundations upon which every life is built. It asks questions that most people spend years avoiding. Where do you truly feel safe? Which relationships nourish your spirit rather than simply occupying your time? Which parts of your identity genuinely belong to you, and which were slowly created by fear, expectation, or survival? During this new moon, those questions become impossible to ignore. The remarkable thing is that the answers rarely arrive through loud emotional experiences. More often, they emerge through quiet certainty. Instead of overwhelming you with emotion, the universe gently removes the emotional noise that has prevented you from hearing your own intuition clearly. Imagine standing beside a lake after a violent storm. For hours, the water has been filled with waves, making it impossible to see beneath the surface. Then the wind slowly disappears. The waves become smaller. The water begins growing still. Nothing new has been added to the lake, yet suddenly you can see all the way to the bottom because the movement that once distorted your vision has finally settled. That is exactly how this new moon begins working inside your emotional world. It does not necessarily give you new answers. It removes the emotional turbulence that prevented you from recognizing the answers already waiting within you. Many people spend years believing they need more information before they can finally move forward. Yet what they often need is less emotional noise, less fear, less overthinking, less attachment to outcomes that no longer reflect the future quietly trying to emerge. July 14th creates exactly that opportunity. It invites you to stop asking who you were yesterday and begin asking who your soul has quietly been preparing you to become. And just when this emotional stillness begins settling into place, July 15th introduces another layer to the story, one that gently reminds you that every genuine new beginning eventually asks for one thing in return: the courage to think differently than you did before. Because every new beginning eventually reaches a moment where possibility must become action. Earlier, I mentioned that the new moon in Cancer does not begin by changing your circumstances. It begins by changing your emotional foundation. That distinction matters far more than most people realize because nearly every lasting transformation in life follows exactly the same pattern. First, your inner world quietly changes. Then, your decisions begin changing. Only afterward does the outside world slowly reorganize itself around the person you have become. Most people expect the opposite. They wait for external circumstances to improve before allowing themselves to think differently, believe differently, or live differently. Yet astrology repeatedly suggests something much deeper. Reality often mirrors the emotional foundation you quietly build long before anyone else can see it. That is why these next hours deserve your complete attention. They are not simply introducing another lunar cycle. They are inviting you to examine the invisible beliefs that have quietly directed your life for much longer than you realize. Think about how many decisions are made every single day without conscious awareness. The conversations you avoid, the opportunities you immediately reject because they feel unfamiliar, the relationships you continue protecting even after they have stopped bringing peace into your life. The dreams you quietly convince yourself are unrealistic before giving them a genuine chance to grow. None of those choices appear dramatic while they are happening, yet together they slowly create the emotional architecture of an entire future. The remarkable thing about the new moon is that it quietly interrupts that unconscious momentum. It creates one of those rare moments when you become capable of seeing your own emotional habits from the outside instead of automatically living through them. Imagine walking through the same neighborhood every day for years. Eventually, every street becomes so familiar that you stop noticing it. The houses blur together. The small details disappear. Then one morning you climb to the top of a nearby hill and look down from above. Suddenly, you recognize patterns that were completely invisible while standing inside them. Roads connect differently than you imagined. Certain paths always lead to the same destination. Other streets quietly open into places you never knew existed. The neighborhood itself has not changed. Only your perspective has. That is exactly what this new moon quietly offers. It lifts your awareness above the emotional routines you have been living inside, allowing you to recognize patterns that have quietly repeated themselves for years. Some of those patterns have protected you. Others have limited you. The difficult part is that both often feel equally familiar. Human beings naturally confuse familiarity with safety because the nervous system prefers what it already understands, even when what it understands no longer supports genuine growth. That is why leaving unhealthy situations often feels frightening, even when staying has become painful. Your emotions are responding to familiarity. Your intuition is responding to truth. These next 48 hours quietly ask which voice deserves your trust. There comes a moment in every person's journey when survival and growth begin pointing in opposite directions. Survival whispers, remain where everything is predictable. Growth quietly replies, the life you have been praying for exists beyond what already feels comfortable. Almost every meaningful transformation begins inside that silent conversation. No one else can hear it. No one else can answer it for you. Yet the decision made there eventually shapes everything that follows. This is why Cancer energy becomes so emotionally powerful. It does not simply ask what you want from life. It asks what kind of emotional home you have created inside yourself. Because no matter where you travel, no matter who enters your life, no matter how successful you become, you carry that emotional home with you everywhere. If it has been built upon fear, every opportunity eventually feels uncertain. If it has been built upon self-doubt, every compliment quietly feels temporary. If it has been built upon the belief that love must always be earned through sacrifice, every relationship slowly begins repeating that same emotional lesson. The new moon gently begins rebuilding that foundation from the inside outward, not through dramatic miracles, but through quiet awareness that slowly becomes a different way of living. During these hours, many people will unknowingly reach a point where they stop asking questions they have carried for months. Not because every answer suddenly appears, but because the questions themselves quietly lose their emotional power. There is an enormous difference between finding an answer and no longer needing one. One satisfies curiosity. The other creates freedom. Imagine carrying a heavy key in your pocket every single day because you believe one day you will finally discover the door it belongs to. Years pass. You continue searching. Then one morning you quietly realize there was never a locked door in front of you at all. The prison existed only inside the belief that you still needed permission to move forward. The key immediately loses its importance. Not because it changed, but because your understanding changed. That is one of the hidden gifts of this new moon. It quietly helps you release emotional responsibilities that were never actually yours to continue carrying. And just as this inner renewal begins settling into place, the energy of July 15th starts introducing something completely different. Earlier this week, the universe asked you to remember. Then it asked you to understand. Now it begins asking whether you are willing to think differently than the version of yourself that created yesterday's emotional reality. Because every new chapter eventually reaches a point where old thinking can no longer produce the future waiting ahead. July 15th quietly becomes that threshold. Mercury, still moving through its reflective retrograde journey, begins forming a challenging relationship with Uranus, the planet of awakening, innovation, liberation, and unexpected realization. This is not simply an intellectual alignment. It is a collision between familiar thinking and completely new possibility. Mercury naturally wants to organize the world through memories, logic, and previous experience. Uranus asks a completely different question. What if the future cannot be understood through the same beliefs that created the past? That question alone has the power to transform an entire life. Because every breakthrough humanity has ever experienced began with someone willing to imagine that reality could be different from what everyone else accepted as normal. On a personal level, this alignment quietly begins creating exactly that kind of awakening. Thoughts that have repeated for years suddenly begin losing their certainty. Beliefs that once felt unquestionable start revealing unexpected cracks. You may catch yourself reacting differently to situations that once controlled your emotions. You may notice ideas appearing that feel unfamiliar yet strangely exciting. You may realize that the future you feared only existed because you continued imagining it through yesterday's perspective instead of tomorrow's awareness. That is the extraordinary invitation hidden inside these next hours. The universe is not asking you to become a different person overnight. It is simply asking whether you are finally willing to imagine a different future than the one your past kept convincing you was inevitable. What makes July 15th especially remarkable is that it quietly asks a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Not because they are unwilling to answer it, but because they rarely realize the question exists in the first place. Earlier, I mentioned that Mercury begins challenging Uranus, creating a tension between familiar thinking and unexpected possibility. At first glance, this appears to be an intellectual alignment. Many people assume it simply affects communication, technology, travel, or ordinary decision-making. Yet beneath those everyday expressions exists something much deeper. Mercury governs the story you tell yourself every single day without even realizing it. It shapes the inner conversations that determine how you interpret success, failure, relationships, opportunity, disappointment, and even your own identity. Every belief you quietly repeat eventually becomes the lens through which you experience reality. Uranus does not arrive to argue with those beliefs. It arrives to ask whether they still belong to the future trying to emerge. Imagine carrying an old map while traveling through a city that has completely transformed over the last 20 years. New roads have been built. Old bridges no longer exist. Entire neighborhoods have changed beyond recognition. Yet you continue trusting the outdated map because it once helped you reach your destination. Eventually, the map itself becomes the reason you feel lost. Not because it was always wrong, but because it no longer reflects the world standing in front of you. Human consciousness often works exactly the same way. Many people continue navigating their present lives using emotional maps created during painful experiences that happened years ago. A person who was repeatedly rejected may continue believing they are difficult to love even after meeting people capable of loving them deeply. Someone who experienced constant criticism may continue doubting every achievement long after becoming remarkably successful. Another person may continue expecting disappointment because disappointment once became so familiar that hope itself began feeling dangerous. None of these beliefs were originally chosen. They were created by experience. Yet over time, they quietly became accepted as permanent truth. During these next hours, Mercury and Uranus begin challenging those emotional maps with extraordinary intensity. Suddenly, your usual way of interpreting situations begins feeling incomplete. You notice yourself questioning assumptions you have carried for years. Certain fears no longer sound as convincing as they did only days ago. Ideas that once seemed impossible begin feeling strangely realistic. It almost feels as though another version of yourself has quietly begun speaking beneath the voice you have always listened to. That experience often surprises people because genuine awakening rarely feels dramatic. It feels strangely natural, as though a truth you somehow always knew has finally found the right moment to reveal itself. This is why so many breakthroughs happen unexpectedly. They appear sudden only because the invisible preparation remained hidden for so long. Think carefully about every major turning point in your own life. The decision itself probably happened in a single moment. Yet the emotional preparation leading toward that decision may have been quietly unfolding for months, perhaps even years. The same principle applies here. These next 48 hours are not creating an entirely new person. They are allowing the person you have slowly been becoming to finally step into the light. Earlier this week, you were invited to remember. Then you were invited to understand. Yesterday, you were invited to release what no longer belonged. Today, something completely different begins unfolding. The universe quietly invites you to imagine a future that is no longer limited by the emotional expectations of your past. That invitation may sound simple, but it changes everything. Because most people do not actually live according to present reality. They live according to remembered reality. They continue expecting yesterday's disappointments to repeat themselves tomorrow. They assume the next relationship will end like the last one. They believe new opportunities will eventually collapse because previous opportunities did. Without realizing it, they recreate emotional certainty from experiences that no longer define who they are. Uranus gently interrupts that unconscious cycle. It asks one extraordinary question. If you no longer carried the emotional weight of yesterday, what kind of future would you finally allow yourself to believe in? Do not answer that question too quickly. Sit with it. Because somewhere inside that possibility exists the life your intuition has been quietly preparing you to recognize. Imagine waking tomorrow with absolutely no memory of every fear that has followed you throughout your life. No memory of rejection, no memory of failure, no memory of betrayal, voice that convinced you to expect less than your spirit quietly desired. How differently would you approach the opportunities standing in front of you today? Which conversations would suddenly become possible? Which dreams would no longer seem unrealistic? Which version of yourself would naturally begin appearing without effort? The remarkable thing is that this question is not simply philosophical. It reflects exactly what these planetary movements have been preparing beneath the surface. The new moon did not arrive merely to begin another lunar cycle. It arrived to create emotional space. Mercury did not slow down merely to create reflection. It slowed down to reveal hidden understanding. Uranus does not disrupt ordinary thinking simply to create uncertainty. It opens the door to perspectives that could never appear, while old beliefs continued controlling your awareness. And when these energies begin working together, something extraordinary becomes possible. You stop asking life to repeat what already feels familiar, and you quietly become available for experiences that once seemed impossible. That is often the moment genuine destiny begins revealing itself. Not because fate suddenly changes direction, but because your consciousness finally becomes capable of recognizing the direction it has always been moving toward. Many people spend years searching for signs from the universe while overlooking the greatest sign of all: the quiet realization that they are no longer the person who once accepted a future built upon fear. That realization is beginning now. And although almost nobody around you may notice it immediately, months from today you may look back and recognize that these 2 ordinary days quietly marked the beginning of an entirely different life. One built not upon survival, but upon trust, not upon old wounds, but upon new wisdom, and not upon the limits your past tried to place around you, but upon the limitless future your soul had been patiently preparing for all along.